They said every girl in Willow Creek had her suitor, except one. Her name was Eliza May Carter. She lived with her mother in a small wooden house by the wheat fields, where mornings began before the sun had even thought to rise. The air was still cold when Eliza stood by the oven, her hands dusted with flour, shaping loaves of bread with slow, careful movements. The fire glowed softly, painting her face in amber light. Her mother watched her from the corner, a thin blanket over her shoulders, her eyes filled with quiet worry. "You bake like your father did," her mother said gently. "Only, he never had such tenderness in his hands." Eliza smiled faintly. "Bread listens, Mama. If you rush it, it hardens. If you care for it, it rises gentle." Her mother nodded, though her gaze lingered a moment too long. She worried that her daughter spent her kindness on dough and strangers, but never on herself. When the sun climbed over the horizon, Eliza wrapped the loaves in cloth and carried them to town. The basket was heavy, but her heart heavier still. The streets of Willow Creek were full of laughter that always seemed to fade when she passed. Two young women by the fabric stall whispered behind their fans. "There she goes again," one said, "carrying bread like it's a wedding gift no one will take." The other giggled. "Ain't no man in this town strong enough to carry her across a threshold." Eliza kept walking, pretending not to hear. Her cheeks burned, but her eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. She had learned long ago that tears only made them laugh louder. She reached her spot by the old fountain and began arranging her loaves. The smell of warm bread soon filled the air, drawing a few kind souls who greeted her politely but never stayed to talk. For them, she was just the baker's daughter, good for business, not for love. That afternoon, 3 men stood near the blacksmith's porch. Their voices carried easily through the market. "Heard old Carter's girl still hoping for a husband," one said. Another laughed. "A husband? Maybe a mule could handle her, but not a man." The third spat on the ground. "Maybe she should bake herself a groom, she sure knows her way around the oven." Their laughter tore through her like shards of glass. She froze, her hands trembling. The basket slipped from her fingers, loaves rolling onto the dusty ground. The world blurred for a moment, the noise of the market fading into a dull echo. She turned away quickly before anyone saw her tears. Eliza walked without knowing where she was going. Her feet carried her past the edge of town, down the dirt path that led to the fields, until she reached the old oak tree by the riverbank. It was her secret place, the only place that never judged her. She sank to the ground and pressed her palms against the earth. "Why, Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you make me this way? To be laughed at, to be unwanted?" The wind moved gently through the leaves, but no answer came. She buried her face in her hands and cried until her chest ached. The river kept flowing beside her, calm and uncaring, as if to remind her that life went on, with or without kindness. When the sun began to fall, she walked home in silence. Her mother was waiting by the window, mending a torn dress. She didn't ask what had happened. A mother doesn't need words to know when her child's heart is broken. They ate in silence that night. The house felt smaller than usual, as if sadness itself had taken a seat at the table. Eliza went to bed early, but her mother stayed awake. Margaret Carter knelt by her daughter's bedside, her frail hands clasped together in prayer. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "you took her father early, but please, don't take her hope. Send her someone, not rich, not proud, just someone who will see her as I do, see the gold in her heart." The candle on the table flickered weakly, its light trembling like her voice. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain. Somewhere beyond the wheat fields, a lone horse moved along the road, a quiet man riding toward Willow Creek, unaware that his path would soon cross with the girl nobody wanted. And when it did, neither of them would ever be the same again. Underscore 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 underscore. The morning sun rose slowly over Willow Creek, spilling gold across the hills and broken fences. Far beyond the town, where the land stretched wide and quiet, a man rode alone on a brown horse. His name was Thomas Reed. His clothes were worn, his face tanned by years of sun, and his eyes carried the weight of things he no longer spoke about. He had come from the west, leaving behind a farm that no longer felt like home. They said he once had a wife and a little boy, both taken by fever one cruel winter. Since then, he had lived like a shadow, moving from town to town, working the soil, sleeping beneath the open sky. People said he was a man who talked little and worked much. A man who buried his grief in the dirt he tilled. When Thomas arrived at Willow Creek, he bought a small piece of land near the river, an abandoned farmhouse with crooked shutters and wild vines growing through its porch. Most men would have turned away from a place like that. But Thomas saw something in it, quiet, forgotten, and in need of care. It reminded him of himself. He worked alone from dawn to dusk, fixing fences, planting seed, and repairing the roof one plank at a time. The townsfolk watched from a distance. Some said he was strange, others said he was kind. No one knew for sure, and Thomas did not care to explain himself. One afternoon, he rode into town to trade grain for flour. The market was busy, filled with laughter and music. He dismounted near the fountain, tied his horse, and walked among the stalls. That was when he saw her. Eliza stood behind a small wooden table covered with loaves of bread, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron. The smell of cinnamon and fresh dough drifted through the air. Her hair had come loose from its braid, and a small streak of flour crossed her cheek. She looked tired, but her eyes were soft, like someone who still tried to see good in a world that had given her little in return. Thomas watched her struggle to lift a heavy sack of flour onto her table. The men nearby laughed quietly, pretending not to notice. He stepped forward without a word and took the sack from her hands. His touch was steady, gentle. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. He only nodded, setting the sack down with ease. "You shouldn't lift that alone," he said simply. She smiled, a small, uncertain smile that faded as quickly as it came. "No one else seems to mind watching." He looked at her for a long moment, then replied, "Maybe they've forgotten how to see." She didn't understand what he meant, and before she could ask, he tipped his hat and walked away. The townsfolk whispered as he passed. "That's the new farmer," someone said. "Strange man. Keeps to himself." Another replied, "Stranger still, helping Carter's girl. He'll learn soon enough." Eliza stood still for a moment, her heart beating faster than it should. No man had spoken to her that way before, without pity, without mockery, only truth. She watched him mount his horse and ride away, the dust rising behind him like a fading memory. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought of his voice. Calm. Steady. Not cruel. Just honest. She tried to push it from her mind, but something in it lingered, a quiet warmth she hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, on his farm, Thomas sat on the porch, sharpening his tools beneath the dim light of a lantern. The night was still, except for the sound of crickets and the slow beating of his heart. For the first time in a long while, he caught himself thinking of a woman's face, not his late wife's, but the baker's daughter in town, the one who looked at him not with fear or curiosity, but with something gentler. He frowned, set his knife aside, and looked toward the moonlit fields. He had come to Willow Creek to be left alone. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. And somewhere between the quiet hum of crickets and the sigh of the wind, both Eliza and Thomas fell asleep not knowing that the next time they met, their lives would begin to change. Underscore 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 underscore. The harvest fair came with the smell of roasted corn, sweet cider, and hay freshly cut from the fields. Banners fluttered above the town square, and music drifted through the air. For most, it was a day of joy, laughter, and courtship. For Eliza, it was a day she had feared all year. Her mother urged her to go, to wear the blue dress she had sewn with trembling hands, the one she called her lucky dress. Eliza had never felt lucky, but she wanted to make her mother smile. She tied her hair with a ribbon, brushed the flour from her fingers, and looked at herself in the small cracked mirror. Her reflection stared back, uncertain, fragile. She took a breath and whispered, "Just for one day." When she arrived at the fair, the sun was already high, glinting off the brass instruments of the band and the polished boots of the young men. Girls in bright dresses spun in circles, laughter spilling through the air like falling petals. Eliza walked slowly through the crowd, her basket in hand, the sound of her footsteps drowned beneath the music. She found a small spot near the edge of the square and laid out her bread, just as she always did. The scent soon reached the passers-by, and people stopped to buy, smiling politely before moving on. But she saw the glances, the half-hidden smirks, the quick nudges between friends. Near the dancing floor, a group of young men stood watching. One of them, dressed in a new vest, called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, who's brave enough to dance with the baker's daughter? Careful, boys, you'll need strong arms." Laughter broke like thunder around her. Eliza's hands froze on the loaf she was wrapping. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. She had learned that silence was the only shield she had left. Another man added, "She makes fine bread, I'll give her that. Maybe that's why she eats so much of it." The laughter grew louder, crueler. A few women giggled behind their fans. Eliza felt the ground tilt beneath her. Then came the final blow. One of the boys, half drunk and foolish, ran to the animal pen and pulled out a small piglet, pink and squealing. He carried it toward her table and set it down beside her basket. "Look, she brought her twin," he shouted. The crowd roared. Eliza's face went pale. Her hands trembled, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. For a moment, the noise faded, and all she could hear was the sound of her own heart breaking. She turned, left the table behind, and walked through the crowd as the laughter followed her like smoke. No one stopped her. Not one voice spoke in her defense. She walked until the music was gone, until the sound of the fair was just a dull hum behind her. The path led to the riverbank, the same place she always went when the world grew too heavy to bear. The air was still, the water calm, as if nature itself waited to hear her cry. She fell to her knees and pressed her face into her hands. The tears came now, unrestrained, born of shame and loneliness. "Why?" she whispered between sobs. "What have I done to deserve their cruelty?" The wind shifted. A shadow moved across the ground. "Eliza," a voice said quietly. She turned, startled. Thomas stood a few steps away, hat in hand, his eyes dark with something between sorrow and anger. He had followed her from the fair, having seen everything. "I told you not to come," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, just go." He didn't move. "I couldn't stand there and do nothing." "You should have," she said bitterly. "It's what everyone else does." He stepped closer. "I'm not everyone else." She looked away, her tears falling freely now. "You don't understand. They laugh at me. They always have. I'm nothing here, Thomas. Nothing but a joke." He knelt beside her. "You're wrong." She shook her head. "You didn't hear them." "I heard every word," he said softly. "And I heard your silence. That took more strength than their cruelty ever will." She looked up at him then, her eyes red but searching. "Why do you care?" Thomas hesitated before answering. "Because I know what it feels like to be watched, to be whispered about, to carry a grief no one else sees." The river shimmered between them. The air hung heavy with words neither dared to speak. Finally, Eliza whispered, "I just wanted to feel like I belonged." Thomas's gaze softened. "You do. You just haven't found where yet." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stood and offered his hand. "Come on. I'll walk you home." She hesitated before placing her hand in his. His touch was warm, steady. They walked in silence through the fading light, the fair now far behind them. That night, Eliza sat by her window long after her mother had gone to bed. The sound of the fair had vanished into the distance. Only the memory of Thomas's words remained. And somewhere beyond the hills, in the quiet of his farmhouse, Thomas stared at the stars and thought of her. The woman who had been laughed at by the world but had somehow found the strength to stand again. Neither of them knew it yet, but the cruelest day of her life had just opened the door to something she had never dared to hope for. The next morning came wrapped in silence. The fairgrounds were empty now, the laughter gone, leaving only footprints in the dust and scraps of ribbons fluttering in the wind. Eliza stayed in bed long after sunrise. Her mother called her twice, but she didn't answer. Her heart felt too heavy to lift. She finally rose when the light fell across her face, warm and uninvited. She washed her hands, braided her hair, and walked to the kitchen. Her mother watched her closely, but Eliza said nothing. The hurt was still too fresh to name. She baked bread, slow and quiet, as if every turn of her wrist might smooth away the ache inside her chest. By afternoon, she carried a basket to the river, needing to be away from the whispers that still clung to town. The air smelled of rain. The sky had dimmed to a soft gray. She sat beneath the oak tree where she had cried before, her fingers tracing circles in the dirt. She didn't hear the footsteps until they were close. When she turned, Thomas stood there again, holding his hat against the wind. "I thought you might be here," he said. Her eyes lowered. "You shouldn't have come. I wanted to see if you were all right." "I'm fine." Her voice was brittle, like glass about to crack. "No, you're not," he said. "I saw what they did yesterday. No one deserves that." Eliza swallowed hard. "You saw, and now you pity me. That's worse." Thomas's brow furrowed. "I don't pity you. Then what do you call it?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I call it respect." She looked up, startled. "Respect? You didn't run when they laughed," he said. "You walked away. You didn't curse or cry out. You carried your pain with dignity. Most people can't do that." Eliza shook her head. "You don't understand. They'll never stop. No matter what I do, I'll always be the girl no one wants." Thomas took a slow step closer. "You believe that because they taught you to. But they don't know what they're looking at." She turned away, staring at the river. "And what do you see, Thomas Reed?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I see someone who reminds me that kindness still lives in this world. I see a woman who gives more than she takes, who works harder than anyone I know. I see strength. Her breath caught, unsure whether to believe him. You don't know me. I know enough, he said softly. Enough to know I'd like to. The wind rose, carrying the faint scent of rain and wheat. Eliza's heart began to race, not from fear but from something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Thomas knelt beside her, his voice lower now. When I lost my wife, I thought love had ended for me. The house was empty. The fields were quiet. I thought I'd buried every piece of my heart with her. But then I met you. Her lips parted slightly, but she couldn't speak. You remind me of the woman I loved, he continued. Not in how you look, but in what you carry inside. She had a way of softening the world, just like you do. You bake bread for people who mock you. You forgive what others would hate. That kind of heart doesn't come twice in a lifetime. Eliza's eyes glistened. Why are you telling me this? Because, he said, his voice trembling just enough to be human, I want you to come to my farm. Not because I pity you, not because I need help, but because I want you there. I can't promise riches or easy days, but I can promise respect, and a place where no one laughs at you. She shook her head slowly. People will talk. Let them, he replied. They always will. But they don't decide who we are. The sky broke then, a light rain falling through the trees. Eliza looked up at the drops sliding down her face, mingling with her tears. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she whispered. You are, he said. You just haven't seen it yet. He reached out his hand. She hesitated for a heartbeat that felt like forever, then placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, steady, unshakable. They stood beneath the oak tree as the rain fell harder, washing away the dust of yesterday. For the first time, Eliza didn't feel small. She didn't feel unwanted. She felt seen. Thomas looked at her, rain glinting on his lashes. Come tomorrow, he said. Help me bake for the harvest workers. I could use your skill. She managed a fragile smile. You don't even know if I bake well. I know enough to trust you. He stepped back, mounted his horse, and tipped his hat before riding away. Eliza stood there long after he was gone, her heart pounding, her fingers still warm where his hand had been. When she finally walked home, her mother saw the difference in her eyes. She didn't ask questions. She only smiled softly and whispered a prayer of thanks. That night, Eliza lay awake listening to the rain on the roof. For the first time in years, her tears were not from pain, but from something gentler, something beginning. And somewhere beyond the hills, Thomas sat by his window, staring into the dark, whispering a quiet truth to himself. She doesn't know it yet, he said, but she's the reason I can breathe again. Underscore 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 underscore. The morning after the rain, the fields around Willow Creek shone gold beneath a pale sun. The air was clean, sweet with the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. Eliza walked the narrow road toward Thomas Reed's farm, her basket clutched tight, her heart uncertain. Every step felt like a question, one she didn't yet know how to answer. When she reached the gate, Thomas was already outside, mending a fence. He looked up, his face calm but his eyes warm with quiet relief. You came, he said simply. Eliza nodded. You asked me to. He smiled faintly. And I meant it. She followed him to the farmhouse. It was old and plain, but clean and cared for, with ivy curling around the porch rail and a line of sunflowers leaning toward the light. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and grain. It wasn't grand, but it felt safe. Thomas showed her the kitchen, bare shelves, a brick oven, a sturdy table. It's not much, he said, but it works. Eliza brushed her hand over the counter. I can work with this. He brought her flour, milk, and a small jar of honey. The men helping with the harvest come by at dusk, he said. They'll need bread. Think you can help me feed them? She smiled softly. I can try. As the day passed, they worked side by side. She kneaded dough, humming under her breath, and he repaired tools nearby, glancing over every now and then as if the sound of her voice steadied him. When the oven began to glow, the house filled with the scent of baking bread. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. It had been years since the air had smelled like home. By evening, they served the workers together, passing loaves and cups of cider. The men thanked her politely and left smiling, speaking of her bread long after they had gone. When the yard grew quiet again, Eliza and Thomas sat on the porch steps. The light of the setting sun spread over the fields. It feels different here, she said. How so? He asked. Peaceful, she whispered. No laughter behind my back. No eyes watching what I am. Thomas looked out toward the horizon. You should never have had to hide. The world can be cruel to anyone who doesn't fit its narrow mold. But here, you fit just fine. The days turned into weeks. Each morning, Eliza rose before dawn to bake, her laughter now part of the farm's rhythm. She sang softly while she worked, and Thomas would listen from outside, letting the sound carry through the fields. When storms came, they worked together to cover the grain and save what they could. Her dress would cling to her in the rain, her hands red from the cold, yet she never complained. Thomas watched her with quiet admiration, wondering how someone so often broken by the world could still move with such grace. In the evenings, they shared simple meals, stew, bread, milk, and stories. She spoke of her childhood, of how her father taught her to bake, of how the townsfolk had once been kind before they learned to measure worth by size. Thomas listened without judgment. He spoke of his wife, of how illness took her too quickly, and of the emptiness that followed. Eliza didn't flinch. She only placed her hand gently over his. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "And you don't have to keep proving you deserve to be loved." The silence that followed said more than words ever could. One morning, Thomas found Eliza in the garden, laughing as she tried to chase a chicken that had escaped its coop. Her hair had come loose, her cheeks flushed with color. He stopped, watching her as if afraid to breathe. She caught the bird, turned, and saw him there. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. "What?" she asked, smiling shyly. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just realizing how quiet this place was before you came." That night, as the sky burned orange and red, they stood at the fence watching the wheat sway. Thomas spoke softly. "You've brought life back to this farm, Eliza." She looked at him, her heart catching on his words. "And you've given me a place where I can breathe." As the weeks passed, their bond deepened in the gentle way that time makes trust grow. They didn't need promises or grand gestures, only the comfort of being seen, of sharing the small silences between work and dusk. Then came the storm. Dark clouds rolled in without warning, thunder cracking across the valley. The wind tore through the fields, threatening to destroy the harvest they had tended for months. Thomas ran outside to tie down the grain sacks, shouting for Eliza to stay inside. But she came running through the rain, skirts heavy with mud. Together they worked through the night, soaked and shivering, their hands raw from the rope. When it was over, they stood in the dark, breathless, watching the last lightning fade. The fields were battered but still standing. Eliza leaned against him, too tired to speak. He placed his arm around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have come out," he said quietly. "You needed help," she whispered. He looked down at her, rain dripping from his hair, and something in his chest shifted, something that had been locked away for years. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. She met his gaze. "Maybe I don't deserve you either. But here we are." They both laughed softly, the kind of laughter that comes after tears and struggle. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind air so clear it hurt to breathe. From that day on, they were no longer two lonely souls sharing a farm. They were partners, bound not by words but by work, by kindness, by the quiet rhythm of hearts learning to trust again. And though the town still whispered, Eliza no longer cared. Her laughter rose over the fields, and Thomas's smile came easier with each passing day. The season of healing had begun. Underscore 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 underscore. The harvest came early that year. The field stood golden under the sun, and the scent of ripened wheat drifted through every corner of Willow Creek. Thomas and Eliza worked side by side from dawn to dusk, their hands moving in quiet rhythm, their hearts no longer uncertain. By now, the people in town had grown used to seeing her at his side. Some whispered still, some watched in silence, but none could deny that the woman they once mocked now walked with light in her eyes. Her laughter reached the streets where before only her silence had lived. One morning, while she sold bread in the market, a group of women gathered near, their voices low but sharp. "Imagine that," one said, "the widow's son keeping company with her. He could have had anyone." Another replied, "A shame, really. A man like that wasting himself on her kind." Eliza heard them but did not turn. She packed the bread, took the coins, and smiled at a child who thanked her. The words stung, but no longer sank deep. She had learned that the truth of her life was no longer theirs to decide. When she returned home, Thomas met her at the gate. "You've been quiet today," he said. She looked down at her hands. "I heard them again." He frowned. "What did they say?" "Nothing new. The same things they've always said. That I'm not enough." Thomas stepped closer. "Do you believe them?" She shook her head slowly. "Not anymore. But it still hurts. He brushed the flour from her cheek with his thumb. Then let me take the hurt for a while. That night, as they ate supper by the light of the fire, Thomas seemed distant, thoughtful. Eliza noticed his silence but didn't ask. Outside, the wind moved through the fields like a whisper of something waiting to be said. Days later, word spread that a grand wedding was to be held in town. One of the very women who had mocked Eliza at the fair was to marry a wealthy merchant from the neighboring valley. The whole town was invited. Eliza had no reason to go, but she baked pies to sell, for the guests who would pass through the market that day. When the morning came, the town square bloomed with color. Music filled the air, the kind that makes hearts lighter even when they don't want to be. Eliza stood behind her stall, arranging her pies, trying to stay unnoticed. The bride passed by, adorned in silk, her laughter sharp and proud. Eliza smiled politely, but the old ache stirred inside her. Then the crowd fell silent. Thomas Reed was walking across the square. He wore a clean white shirt, his hat in hand, a bouquet of wildflowers tucked beneath his arm. Every step he took drew eyes. Whispers rippled through the people like a wave. He stopped in front of Eliza's stall. For a moment, she thought he'd come to buy bread. Then he looked at her the way no one ever had, with calm, with certainty, with love that didn't ask permission. "Eliza," he said, his voice strong but steady. She looked up, confused. "Thomas, what are you doing?" He took a breath, then knelt down before her, right there in the middle of the square. The murmurs rose like wind through the trees. No one wanted to marry her, he said, loud enough for every cruel tongue to hear, because she was fat. Because she didn't fit the small box they built for beauty. Gasps swept through the crowd. Eliza's hands trembled. "Thomas, please. Underscore. He went on, his eyes locked on hers. "But I saw her heart. I saw a woman who feeds the hungry, who works until her hands ache, who gives without asking anything in return. I saw a woman who could feed my soul when the world left me starving." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, spilling before she could stop them. The square was utterly still. "She doesn't know it yet," he continued softly, "but she's the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me." No one moved. Even the bride, standing at the edge of the crowd, lowered her gaze. Thomas reached for Eliza's hand. "I don't care who laughs. I don't care what they say. You've made me a better man just by being who you are. Marry me, Eliza. Let them see what love looks like when it's real." Her breath came shallow. The world had mocked her, broken her, left her alone, and now, here he was, offering her everything she had once believed she would never have. "Are you sure?" she whispered. He smiled, eyes glistening. "More sure than I've ever been about anything." For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then she nodded, tears shining on her cheeks. Thomas rose, wrapped his arms around her, and kissed her forehead as the crowd looked on. No one laughed. Not one word was spoken. Only the sound of the wind moved through the square, carrying with it the truth that silence could no longer hide. Kindness had won. The child who had once bought bread from her clapped his hands. Then another joined, and another, until the whole square was filled with applause. Eliza leaned against Thomas, her voice trembling but firm. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," he said. "Because they needed to hear it. And you needed to know it." She smiled through her tears. "I already did. But hearing it out loud made it real." He held her hand as they walked through the crowd together, the whispers gone, replaced by something quieter, respect. The sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the fields in gold. Eliza looked up at Thomas, her heart full, and whispered, "I used to think love was for everyone but me." Thomas looked down at her, his voice tender. "Love's been waiting, Eliza. It just needed someone brave enough to answer." And as they walked home, the last of the day's light followed them like a promise kept. Underscore. The morning of their wedding came with a sky soft as cream and the scent of lilacs floating through the fields. The town had never been so still. Even the church bell seemed to wait before it rang. Eliza stood before a small mirror in the farmhouse bedroom, her hands trembling as she tied the ribbon at her waist. The dress was simple, ivory and cotton, sewn by her mother's careful hands. It was not grand, but it felt honest, like the life she was about to begin. Margaret Carter wiped a tear from her eye. "You look like yourself," she whispered. "And that's more beautiful than anything fine gold could buy." Eliza smiled, her voice low. "I don't want to be anyone else today." Outside, Thomas waited near the fence, dressed in his best shirt, his hat held nervously at his side. The guests gathered slowly, neighbors, workers, and even those who once laughed at her. Some brought flowers, others small gifts wrapped in cloth. None spoke of the past. The air was heavy with something new, something close to grace. When Eliza stepped out of the house, the crowd turned. The breeze lifted her veil just enough for Thomas to see her eyes, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. He reached out his hand. She took it. Together they walked down the short path toward the old oak tree by the river, the same place where she had once wept alone. There, beneath its wide branches, stood the preacher, an old man with kind eyes. The wind stirred the leaves as he opened his Bible, but before he could speak, Thomas turned to Eliza and took both her hands in his. "I've waited long enough to say this again," he said softly. "You saved me, Eliza. You brought warmth back to a house that forgot what laughter sounded like." Tears filled her eyes. "And you gave me a place where I could stand without shame." The preacher smiled and began his words, his voice gentle over the hush of the river. When he asked Thomas if he would take Eliza as his wife, Thomas answered without hesitation, "With all that I am." When he asked Eliza, her reply trembled but did not break. "Always." When the ceremony ended, the townsfolk clapped softly, as though afraid to disturb the sacredness that had filled the air. The music began, an old fiddle tune, slow and tender. Thomas and Eliza danced on the grass, barefoot and laughing. Children ran around them, tossing petals. Even the women who once whispered came forward with shy smiles, placing small bouquets in Eliza's hands. "Your bread," one said quietly, "it's the best in the valley." Eliza laughed through her tears. "There's plenty for everyone." The sun dipped lower, turning the sky to gold. Tables were set outside the farmhouse, laden with food baked from Eliza's own oven. People who had never shared a meal before now sat side by side. Laughter replaced the old cruelty, and for once, no one felt lesser or greater than another. As the evening faded, Eliza and Thomas slipped away from the crowd and walked to the porch. The fields glowed in the last light of day. Crickets began to sing. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wonder how it all changed?" Thomas looked at her hand resting in his. "It didn't change," he said. "We did. We stopped hiding from what was good." She smiled, closing her eyes. "I used to think love was something you had to earn. But it isn't, is it?" "No," he said. "It's something you give, and if you're lucky, it finds its way back." The moon rose, casting silver over the quiet land. The guests began to leave, one by one, carrying pieces of bread wrapped in cloth. Eliza watched them go, her heart full. "Maybe they'll remember this," she said. "They will," Thomas replied. "They'll remember what kindness looks like when it's real." Inside, her mother sat by the window, smiling softly at the sight of them. She whispered a prayer of thanks, the same prayer she had once made in tears, now answered in light. As the night deepened, Eliza and Thomas sat together on the porch, fingers entwined, the world at last at peace around them. The lantern flickered, the crickets sang, and the wind carried the soft smell of bread cooling on the sill. Eliza looked out over the fields and spoke the words she would one day tell her children. "Beauty fades, but kindness feeds the soul forever." Thomas kissed her forehead, his voice a promise in the dark. "And that's the only truth that ever mattered." The stars blinked above the quiet farm, and the river whispered below the oak. For the first time, the girl nobody wanted had everything she ever needed, love that saw her, love that stayed. And in that small corner of the world, under a sky full of mercy, two hearts finally rested. Underscore 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 underscore. And so, beneath the golden sky of Willow Creek, love proved stronger than cruelty. Because no beauty shines brighter than a heart that dares to be kind. Thank you for watching, my friends. If this story touched your heart, leave your like, share it with someone who believes in true love. And don't forget to subscribe. Because in every sunset of the Old West, another story is waiting to be told.